Thank you. Thank you all for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and to get to know students in other departments. So, yes, I'm going to speak to you a little bit about my work, broadly about my first book, which is out, and then to talk a little bit more about the current moment in relationship to social justice, and then hopefully have some provocations, especially as you are planning students, right? It's a little bit different than students who are American Studies major, not majors, but American Studies doctoral students, since uh, American Studies students tend to be a little bit of everything. They're kind of like everywhere, doing museum stuff, doing art stuff, doing teaching, K through 12, community college. But as planning students, it seems that your path is a little bit more defined, more narrow. So hopefully I can speak a little bit to that as well. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I came to my project. So my first book is called Nuevo South, Latinas, Latinos, Asians, and the Remaking of Place. And it's a book that that focuses on three groups: Vietnamese refugees in 1975, Cuban refugees in 1980, and Mexican immigrants in the 1990s in the state of Arkansas. So often one of the questions I get is, how did you come to your project? And I came to my project because my family was part of that migration from other parts of the country to Arkansas. So in my case, my family had lived for many years in California. That's where I grew up. And then there was an economic decline in the mid 90s that hit California really hard. Really hard. Later, I came to understand this was part of deindustrialization. And through social networks, literally, one of my godfathers had followed one of his brothers to Arkansas. And in turn, my godfather called my dad and was like, you should come out. There are plenty of jobs. It's a low cost of living. It's really tranquilo, right? It's tranquil. It's a great place to raise a family. And we made the trek out there. So what happened when I moved to Arkansas was that people thought I was Vietnamese. And I didn't understand how I, who was obviously, I'm using quotes, Mexican, could be thought of as Vietnamese. I didn't understand that at all. And then later, I realized that the reason why people thought I was Vietnamese is because the only non-Black, non-white group that was in the area were Southeast Asians, largely Vietnamese. Then I went to college outside of Little Rock, where there was a very, very, very tiny Southeast Asian community, and they really weren't. They were really absent in people's imaginations. So people in my college town thought I was white sometimes, and that really threw me for a loop. I was like, Vietnamese I can understand. Right? Like maybe we have dark hair, other things. We're petite, I don't know. But white, I just really couldn't compute. And so I went to graduate school for a couple reasons. I wanted to understand what had happened in moving from California in the 1990s to Arkansas in the 1990s. And then I also wanted to understand how my race could change just by moving geographically. And what I didn't know was that the questions I was asking were really questions about space and place, right? They were questions about geography. So today I identify very much as an American Studies scholar, as a Latinx Studies scholar, but somebody who is really kind of at the intersection of history as a field and geography as a field. Even as I want to really emphasize is, I had no idea what geography was as a field when I went to graduate school. I went to graduate school thinking that I was going to write just about Mexican immigrants, since I was trying to understand, again, what I came to realize was like the racialization of Mexicans in Arkansas. So how we were understood in terms of race and ethnicity in a new state, how that was different than California, what those factors were around language, around sound, around dress, around phenotype. And again, I didn't have all these words, right? So in graduate school, as I started working on preliminary research very early on and started talking to my advisor, who was a historian, who is a historian. In passing, I mentioned, oh, there are Vietnamese people, and he said, and then I just kind of blew past that. He was like, wait, there's Vietnamese people in Arkansas, and I said yes, and I gave him a quick kind of version of what I knew, and he said you should really write about that. And I was like, okay. And then in another meeting, I said, oh yeah, and there were Cubans around 1980, but they're gone. He was like, wait, what? Like, why are you just blowing past these groups? And in talking with him, I really came to understand and believe that in order for me to write the kind of book or then dissertation that I wanted to write, I really needed to engage with the groups that preceded Mexicans and other Latinx immigrants in Arkansas. And even more importantly, as I was again kind of wrapping up the dissertation, I thought I had done a pretty good job writing about groups that preceded Mexican immigrants, Latinx immigrants. The part of Arkansas that I was writing about, which is Northwest Arkansas, so if you divide the state of Arkansas roughly into 4 squares, the northwest corner is what the area I focus on because that's the area that had dynamic Latinx growth in the 1990s. So that quadrant had only about 10,000 African Americans from the 1980, 1990, 2000 census. And the 3 other quadrants that made up the state of Arkansas congressional districts had between 100 and 160,000 African Americans. So as those numbers really kind of hit me, I was like, how is it that this part of the state, this quadrant, is so overwhelmingly white when the rest of the state is not? This is, of course, a former slaveholding state. Where are all the Black people? So I did secondary research and realized that there had been racial cleansing, not just in that part of the state, but there's a whole swath of this part of Middle America from Northwest Arkansas to Southeast Missouri that experienced targeted racial cleansing of this geographic area, right? The consequence thus was that Black communities were lynched, people were lynched, people were killed, people were murdered, and then there was an implementation of sundown towns, which means that sundown towns are towns where a Black person is not allowed to be in the town once the sun sets, for fear of being killed or murdered. So this was a racial program that really defined Arkansas way before Vietnamese arrived in 75, that was maintained through the 20th century. So the book starts with that history because it's important to understand the kind of place that Arkansas was, the particular kind of place that Northwest Arkansas was before Vietnamese, before Cubans, and before Mexicans. And the role that anti-Blackness had in constructing new groups, right? So in short, the argument that I make in the book is that we have to understand anti-Blackness in the United States, in the state of Arkansas, and we have to understand its legacies for the way in which new groups were racialized, were understood. More than that, what I realized was that as groups arrived to the state of Arkansas, each group was received in various ways. So Vietnamese were received reluctantly. They were reluctantly welcomed. These were refugees that were coming in right after the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. This is the first cohort of Vietnamese leaving the country. They were largely educated. The vast majority of them were already English speakers. They had economic resources in Vietnam, right? They're sponsored into different refugee camps across the United States, and one of them is Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. So one of the reasons why Arkansans decided to reluctantly welcome Vietnamese was because of their Christian background, right? This Arkansas is part of the Bible Belt, so they thought it was their Christian duty to welcome people that were in need. And yet the racial difference was one of the reasons why Arkansas also said, oh, we really don't want them here. Like, we'll help them, but we don't really want them here in the state of Arkansas. Nonetheless, some Arkansans sponsored Vietnamese individuals and families into the state. And so there is a small but steadily growing Southeast Asian community in Arkansas. The majority of them are Vietnamese, but there are also Lao people, Cambodians, Thai, and Hmong in Arkansas. And then you have the placement of Cubans in 1980. This is what is usually referred to as Marielitos. So Cubans from the port of Mariel. This is a group that Castro cast as being undesirables. He cast them as escoria, right? As the dregs of society. And so initially, the national media and Cuban exiles were very excited that there was a group of people being able to flee the island. And soon thereafter, within a 2-week period, that discourse shifted from, oh, here are new people that are able to flee, to these are criminals or communists or homosexuals, or they're dangerous, we don't want them, they're gonna make us look bad. And there were a couple of issues there. One is that in order to escape, a lot of people had to have permission from the government to leave. And that permission came in the form of what was called a carta de escoria, literally a drag letter that said they were the worst of society, and that this was a kind of release valve for the administration. There was also a lot of discourse about the fact that these Cubans were criminals. Many of them had been in prison, but they had been in prison for what the US media didn't understand then was that many had been in prison for crimes like selling something on the black market, right? Like a pot or a pan or something else. They were constructed instead of like dangerous, violent criminals, murderers, prostitutes, etc. And the other big difference between this cohort of Cubans and the two prior cohorts that had arrived in the United States is that this group of Cubans had grown up under class or working poor, as opposed to the kind of elite or upper middle class of the island. And they were also largely Black Afro-Cubans. And so when they are placed in the state of Arkansas, Fort Chaffee is again activated as a refugee camp, much to the governor's chagrin. This was a federal decision. In the book, I also write about the ongoing tension between states' rights in these kinds of decisions. So they very much, Arkansas politicians very much were upset that the state was selected as a refugee site without their consent. Nonetheless, it's activated. I think over 25,000 Cubans were placed in Fort Chaffee to be processed. And unlike the case of the Vietnamese, Arkansans do not draw under Christianity or the Christian beliefs to say we owe them something, even though Cubans were also fleeing communist Cuba, right? They were also fleeing communism. And yet that Christian discourse just kind of evaporates. Instead, it's a very anti-criminal, anti-Black discourse about who these people were. To make a more complicated, to add a little bit of complexity, although we tend to talk about Cubans from Mariel as refugees, they actually were the first cohort of Cubans who were not automatically granted refugee status. They had to be processed, they had to be screened. This is something they didn't understand. They didn't know why that was the case. And people started getting a little antsy about everything, about why they were detained. And so there were a couple of uprisings in the camp, a couple of protests. And in one of the uprisings, they managed to break the perimeter and head into town. Now, some Arkansans swear that these Cubans were yelling, "Come on, Castro, let's kill some Americans," which really is quite impossible since this cohort of Cubans did not speak English. And from the pictures of the incident at Fort Chaffee, you do see people running. some people might be holding, like 1 or 2 people out of like 50 might be holding like a rock or a stick, but it's not like a mass armed revolt. And yet that's the way that the state of Arkansas, then Governor Clinton, reacted to it. So Clinton calls in the National Guard, essentially quell the unrest, do their best to try to process people out. In the meantime, the rest of the nation is also not sponsoring this court of Cubans out as fast as other refugee groups. It takes a long time, but eventually everyone is processed out. And a lot of, well, at least one of Clinton's biographers says that his experience with Cubans in Arkansas is what leads him to change national policy towards Cubans. So before Clinton, any Cuban that arrived, before President Clinton, almost any Cuban that arrived was automatically granted a kind of exceptional status in immigration law and had a path to legalization. Clinton changes that to what became known as a wet foot, dry foot policy. Right now, this matters because here's something that happened in, the state of Arkansas that had national repercussions. And there's a lot of there's a lot of work written about the importance of the South and policies that were trialed in the South that then became national. No Child Left Behind is another example of one such policy. There's a lot. The other thing that I wanted to mention too is that although, again, Cubans get taught or constructed as refugees, in 1980, they were not automatically refugees. They were actually Cuban/Haitian entrant, parentheses, status pending, right? That was a very ambiguous legal categorization. And we can talk a little bit more about Haitians, but the big difference between Cuban and Haitians is that Cubans were allowed to reach US shores. They were picked up in international waters and brought to the United States. Haitians were picked up in international waters and sent right back to Haiti, even though they were fleeing a very brutal dictatorship. Haitians that reached US shores were detained and sent back to Haiti, even though they were fleeing a very brutal dictatorship. So even when we're talking about race and two Black national origin groups, right, Cubans and Haitians, there's a vast difference that the specter of communism played in whether the United States literally allowed people to arrive on US shores and to offer a path to legalization, or whether they were outright removed, as in the case of Haitians. In short, there's a lot of anti-Black immigration policy that has defined the United States. And then you have Mexicans, majority Mexicans, but also Guatemalans, Salvadorans are the other two big groups arriving in Arkansas in the 1990s to work in the poultry industry through social networks that say, this is a great place to live, it's tranquil, it's a stable job working in the poultry industry, and also like no checan papeles, right? They're not checking your immigration documents, so you can work if you're undocumented. So there's a dynamic growth of Latinx people in the South in the 1990s, and Latinx migrants end up being the largest growth in the like 50 years since 75 to the current moment. I haven't checked the number. I should have checked the numbers. If the numbers continue to grow, Latinx people in Arkansas are gonna surpass African Americans within a couple of decades. And so we can start thinking about how does the changing South, a South that is becoming more Latinx, how does that matter? How does it change politics? How does that change voting? Without buying into the idea that just because Latinx people are becoming a significant majority, that they are going to support policies that will benefit them, like public schools and free and reduced lunch, and policies that will help other communities, right? There's often this fallacy that immigrants are, within a two-party system are Democrats, which is often not the case, right? But it does mean something that, for example, in that part of Northwest Arkansas that I focus on, Latinx people were the majority non-white group in like 2000, again, because of the dearth of African Americans. So the overall contributions of that book are really to push us to think relationally, right, about the way in which different groups are racialized, not just on their own, but in relationship to each other. So one example of this is that when Latinos started arriving, and there was a push to have bilingual documents, right, state documents, etc. A lot of our Arkansans said, well, we never had to do this for the Vietnamese. We never had to translate for them. Why can't the Mexicans be like the Vietnamese? And actually, that's a fallacy. Arkansans did have to translate for Vietnamese. One, two, also a lot of Vietnamese already came in speaking English because they were the lead of their country in that particular moment. So there's a particular kind of erasure that happens with the history of the group that preceded the new group, and racialized fears are projected onto the new group. And they draw from different threads, right? Like anti-immigration, ideas about illegality. In the case of Vietnamese, in that moment, they were racialized through the trope of yellow peril, right? A specifically anti-Asian sentiment about how Asian people are unassimilable, their families are too big, their language is too different, they're never going to learn to speak English, they're never going to learn to cook indoors. They're just too different to be able to incorporate them, right? So there's always a lot of specificity to racialization, but it also always kind of draws from other groups, from other moments, national anxieties. So in the current moment, I am working on a book on deportation and coerced return, and I won't go into too many details, but I do want to mention that because I think one of the threads between my first project and my current project is that I'm very much interested in space and placemaking, right? Especially for groups that are marginalized, that are constructed as being outsiders or non-normative, different from whatever mainstream society or specific kind of locality, right? Small place I might be thinking about. And so, you know, these are questions, the questions of how is place made, how is race made, are questions that I've been thinking about for a lot of years now. And there are questions that I also have been thinking a lot about in the current moment, right? Because, for example, in the book, I write about what I call acts of spatial illegality. These are instances where Latinx people are not breaking social norms, but they are cast as if they're engaging in illegal behavior. So one of these examples is people being at a park playing soccer, right? A Mexican family playing soccer at a park. Arkansans would say, oh, but they're at the park, you know, they're using public space. They're, you know, it's just all Hispanic now. And of course, the underlying idea there is that if they were white families, one, or if they were playing baseball as opposed to soccer, that wouldn't be a problem, right? So something as quotidian as going to the park became a racialized event, right? Something that stood in for something much broader, right? And the reason I bring that up is because in the current moment, we see the ways in which people's everyday lives are very much policed, right? I mean, in this current moment, literally police, but in other moments outside of, let's say, protests, it's going to the store, right, as a young Black man and buying Skittles, and then a white Latino coming and seeing you and racializing you as dangerous because you're a young Black man and you're wearing a hoodie, right? There are so many dynamics that occur on an everyday level that are all about space making. We protect the society in which we live by policing each other, right? By giving somebody a side eye when we think they're loitering. By, I mean, pre-pandemic, right? Crossing the street when we see someone that looks suspicious, right? These are all behaviors that are about constructing a very particular kind of place. And so I think the current moment really kind of brings that to fruition, right? I mean, we just had the acquittal of Breonna Taylor's killers, right? The cops who the court and jurors found were justified in killing her in her bed. That is all about a neighborhood that is racialized as being dangerous. And more importantly, that the officers were justified in fearing, right? The specter of fear and fearing for their lives, even as people were sleeping, right? That fearing for their lives is based on their neighborhood where Breonna lived and on who she and her boyfriend were, right? Black people. And so, you know, sometimes in the academy, it seems like the work that we're doing is so removed from people's everyday lives, right? But it's the work we do, depending on what kind of focus you take, is so important, right? I teach classes on Latinx studies because I believe in that field. I teach concepts like racialization and place and illegality. And students have told me that they understand their family's experiences in different ways, or that they now have a name for, you know, that feeling or what they saw, but they previously had been unable to articulate that, right? That's one part of the importance of the work that we do. But in addition to that, I think that, you know, the more you know, the more you prepare yourself, the better able, the more prepared then you are to understand the processes you see in everyday life, right? What is happening with policing? What is happening with public schools and their funding? What is happening with charter schools and their funding? What's happening with gentrification, right? Who are business owners? Noelia and Wanda and I were talking about where they are right now, a coffee shop owned by Guatemalans, right? In DC, like that matters. It makes a difference, right? In the DMV area, an area that has had Central American migration for over 40, 50 years, to still be so happy that you find a small business that is owned by a Guatemalan family, right? That's all about placemaking. It contributes something to the neighborhood, right? So you can kind of really value and support financially like a business like this, right? Now, in terms of being, you know, planning students, all of you are going to take different paths even within planning. You know, I think in terms of teaching, you know, teaching, I don't think of this might be, I don't know, provocative. I don't think of teaching as a vocation. I really enjoy teaching most of the time. But it's not a vocation in that I'm not gonna kind of like, I would not be teaching. I'll put it this way, and I think I've told Wanda this when we've had meetings at some point. I would not be teaching still if I had not found a tenure track job. I am not one of those people that would have stayed as an adjunct for more than 3 years, given my own desire for stability and the realization that I could do something else. I don't know, I really don't know what that other thing would have been, but I would not have stuck around to be an adjunct more than 3 years. And I think it's really horrible that we expect people to do that, right? So teaching is something I believe in. It's not a vocation, but it is something that, you know, that really kind of changes people, what they learn. I've had students come and tell me that they have shared something about what we've learned with their families, or shared a video we watched with their families, and that, you know, it was a really kind of dynamic conversation. And I bring those examples up because that's also, to my mind, that's also a form of activism, right? Activism doesn't just take place on the streets, protesting, marching, or donating, although those are very important ways to do that. But they also happen in the classroom if you're able to really kind of teach students something that they hadn't quite learned before, to reach them in a particular way that they're even telling their family about it, right? And their family also learns from something you've taught. More importantly, I think we need to be creative when we think about social justice, right? Oftentimes it's like a very narrow definition. You either march or you donate, or you, right now during the election, you make calls. But I think there's also other manifestations, right, of doing that. Taking care of yourselves. I work with a lot of students who are social justice advocates, and I see even as they're sophomores, they're about to burn out, right, from life because they're doing so many things. Taking care of yourself is really important. Remembering that this is a marathon, not a sprint, right? If you really believe in social justice, then you know that this is not something that is going to be resolved. That it is like a big societal change, right? A society, I'm presuming that if you're an activist, you want a society where the state or the government invests in people, invests in life, as opposed to investing in exposure to premature death, right? Premature death through diabetes, or premature death through incarceration, premature death through environmental discrimination, and you get lung cancer, or you get asthma, right? Because you're living in such a polluted neighborhood. So those kinds of investment, that kind of society requires all kinds of work, but we have to be here in order to continue doing that work, however we might be able to do that. And to know that that work is not something that we might even see in our lifetimes, right? I'm older than maybe most of you on the call. I don't think it's something that, by the time Wanda is 80, she's going to be like, well, we got that done. Now, like, here I'm living in utopia, right? I don't think many of us believe that, because we know, like, it's a very long trek, but we also work toward that because we do hope that at some point we live in a very different society, right? One that really invests in people, all people everywhere, right? All across the board. And, in terms of like planning, like as planning students, I think, regardless of the path you choose, a couple of things. One, you're going to be working for an employer. Unless you start your own business and then construct your own, dynamic, you're going to have an employer. Sometimes I talk to students who are, all about like breaking everything down, and, that's all great. But I then ask them, well, what are you going to have a job? Like, how are you going to eat? Unless you really are willing to move to a very remote area and, have an actual kind of like co-op and be removed completely, which is, or not completely, but be removed to the best of your ability, you're going to be enmeshed in the society in which we live today, not the one you're working toward from, that might exist in 200, 300, 400 years, but the one we live in today. That requires an employer who, in this case, right, in this educational setting, is an institution. The University of Maryland has its own particular policies, its own ways of engagement with the surrounding community. I have my own, critiques about that, but I'm also paid by the state of Maryland, right? So the reason I bring that up is because I think to a certain extent, you also have to have a certain level of pragmatism, of understanding the confines of kind of where you're working, right? So what is it that you're able to advocate for? Is it that you're able to, in my case, right, advocate for higher graduate student stipends? Is it advocating for a different, like engaging differently with the surrounding community? Is it advocating for more Black and Latinx students to be admitted from Prince George's County? These are things that I can do within the institutional confines of the University of Maryland, right? And then there are things that I can do outside of that. You're gonna have a similar experience in your planning careers, right? You should be the person that is always like, oh, here goes Wanda again, asking her a question about, like, shouldn't we think about these particular kind of policies, or shouldn't we consider displacement, right, of communities? You should be that person, right? It's hard to be that person sometimes, but you will be in a position that so few other people have, that if social justice is what you're aiming for, it is part of the responsibility that you have, right? To also be uncomfortable, to also find other people in your field or in your workplace that, you know, agree with you, and see what kind of programs you can implement, right? For those of you who end up working for a city or the state, I mean, hopefully you know by now how important planning projects are, right? Planning projects are the backbone of any city, whether it's gentrification, whether it's public housing, whether it's single unit households, whether it's parks, right? Like planners literally plan the city in which we live. They plan how much green space any neighborhood is going to have. They plan how many metro lines they're going to, or freeways they're gonna cut through any neighborhood. And that has implications for environmental racism. That has implications for access to food, and free space. When I think of planning, actually, I think a lot of homelessness, right? Or houselessness. I hope by now all of you have read. If you haven't, I made sure I wrote it down. Neil Smith, Contours of a Spatialized Politics, right? Because he's a geographer, but he writes very clearly about the importance of the I mean, a lot of things in terms of scale in that particular article, but really he writes about, you know, how we as a society, and you more specifically as planners, literally construct benches that are anti-homeless. These are benches that, instead of being one, you know, smooth, narrow, I mean, smooth, long kind of seat, have either handrails going, splitting it down the middle, or it has some sort of protrusion so that any person who wants to lie down can't comfortably lie down there, right? Why is it that we are investing money in these kinds of endeavors that are literally pushing houseless people to have no other place to even rest for a night, right? Planning in terms of I mean, I think I live in DC, so I think I'm thinking a lot about the fairly recent change to the speeding, right? Like when I moved to DC about 10 years ago, it's like you could drive around the city in like 30 miles an hour, 35 miles an hour, and they've knocked it down to 25 because there were a lot of deaths, right? Pedestrian deaths. Maybe that's getting more far afield from planning itself, but something like that also is a policy that is meant to save lives, right? Am I a little annoyed that I can't go 30? Yeah. Am I going to do 25 because it means I'm less likely to kill somebody? Yeah. Right? Like these policies sometimes seem so banal, so everyday, that like they don't matter, but they very much matter to the people whose lives end, who are killed through these particular kind of policies and displacement, and those whose lives are fostered because you have done something in your career to make that investment and that fostering of life possible, right? So I'm going to end there, and I'm happy to take any questions about anything I've brought up or anything else you might want to hear.
Yay, thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, I see Brittany Wong has one. Do you want to ask it, Brittany? Or do you want me to say it?
Okay, hi, my name's Brittany.
Hi, Brittany.
Yeah, so I just had a question about your book. I haven't had a chance to go through it, but did any of the groups that you discuss in your book experience displacement after arriving to Arkansas? And if so, like what were the social and political contexts that surrounded that displacement?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So yes, the group that experienced displacement after arriving in Arkansas were Cubans. So what happened with Cubans is after Fort Chaffee was closed down. So a couple of things. In the case of Vietnamese, around 2,000 something Vietnamese were sponsored by Arkansans into the state of Arkansas, and so that was the kind of the group that has allowed the Southeast Asian community to grow. In the case of Cubans, only about 400 Cubans were sponsored by Arkansans into the state of Arkansas. And then they were discriminated against, right? They experienced intense racism in Arkansas, and they essentially were pushed out to go to other places like LA or like Florida, to not even reunite with their families. They were just pushed out of the state of Arkansas. And again, this is part of the reason why I think anti-Blackness is really important when we're talking about really any place in the United States, right? I'm not trying to make the South exceptional in that way, but in my in my research area, Northwest Arkansas anti-Blackness was foundational to the kind of place that it was, to such an extent that 100 years later, Arkansans did not want and did not accept Cubans that were placed into the state of Arkansas. And it's a displacement that Vietnamese didn't experience to like any, not any extent, but in such an intense way. And Mexicans, and Latinx people, although they were also marginalized and discriminated against and experienced kind of the policing of the use of space, they were not displaced like this. In fact, again, one of the weird things that happened, well, I shouldn't say weird, one of the illuminating things that happened is that when Mexican and Latinx immigrants were moving into Arkansas, the anti-Black ideas that Arkansans had about who Black people were helped to construct Mexican immigrants in a more positive light. So for example, I have a quote from an educator who says, oh, you know, a high school counselor who says like, oh, we knew that some of the Mexican girls were, or Hispanic is the word they use. We knew that some of the Hispanic girls were having babies in high school, but these kids were planned. They come from the good nuclear family. And she ends up, I forget the exact quote, but the implication is that the Hispanic girls are having babies, are teen moms, but they're good teen moms, unlike the Black girls who are having babies, right? Because the presumption is that the Black girls are from a Black broken home, right? That they're just going to be single mothers. When I knew, just from being part of the community, those babies were not planned. Like Hispanic girls having babies in high school were not planned. They were sleeping with their boyfriends, like so many girls do, and got pregnant and kept the baby. That's not planning. But the ideas around race were such that the same behavior was cast in a very different light. And so you see the kind of different manifestations, right? Because you asked about the political context, and the political context really changes depending on what group is under scrutiny, right? That's what makes these things so difficult, is that you would think that the same political context would have the same even keeled effect, and it doesn't. It varies very much by group.
Thank you so much for answering that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Does anybody else have another question to ask? If you do, you can unmute yourselves and ask it too. No?
I have a question, but I don't think it's like necessarily related to urban planning as much as other questions will be. But I'm curious about your spatial acts of illegality, Dr. Guerrero. And I guess I'm wondering about methods. Like, how do you go about soliciting or like identifying these acts as like spatial acts of illegality? Like how did you come to that?
So this is a really great question, Wanda, and I'm happy to hear you're thinking about method, because it's very important. So, for those of you who have never taken class with me, I'm very big on students being able to identify the research questions or the research question in any reading that we do during seminar and the methods. There's one that can regale you with stories of the key question assignment. But the reason I do that, and this is an assignment that's not mine. This is an assignment that was created by Ruthie Gilmore, right? And so I use it with her permission in my seminars. The reason I believe so much in that kind of assignment is because then students are prepared to, in their own research, think very clearly about what kind of method, right? So, you know, to answer your question, one, I have to take you back, right, to kind of like my research process. So again, I thought I was going to write about, I thought my dissertation was going to be an ethnography, and that it was just going to be about Mexicans. And then I decided, oh, I have to really understand this history. Then I became much more a historical kind of book, although again, many historians would say it's not history. That's fine. It's history enough for me, right? So when I started writing through this more historical lens, my approach was to start, I wanted to understand the way in which each of the groups were constructed. And the best way that I knew to do that, to really have an idea of, like, in 75, what were people saying about Vietnamese, wasn't to ask people in 2000, what did you think about Vietnamese in 75? It was to look at newspaper articles, right? Because newspaper articles had the media, and I could see the way the media was constructing Vietnamese, and I could look to letters to the editor where Kansans wrote in with their ideas about who the Vietnamese were. And then I also looked into gubernatorial archives for letters from constituents to see about the way they were writing to their state representatives about Vietnamese when they thought this was going to be private correspondence. They tended to be a little bit more real about their critiques. And so roughly I did the same thing for Cubans and for Mexicans. And so in doing, you know, like, I literally looked up every instantiation I can think of: Mexican, illegal alien, illegal Mexican alien, Hispanic, farm worker, like every single thing that I could find. And in the first few years, it was just like one of the first stories is like, migrant farm worker teaching locals Spanish. Like, how do you say 10 in Espanol? It's yes, right? And it was this kind of, it was a human interest story. It wasn't like, oh, here are these like illegal aliens. It was more like, oh, birds of passage, right? They're just on their way to somewhere else. So in doing a lot of this reading, I started noticing that the more we got, like, from 1990, 92, 94, 96, 98, like the discourse newspapers were using were like, went from that birds of passage to like, there's 16,000 illegal Mexican aliens in Fort Smith, and, you know, they do this and they do that. And so identifying that construction was kind of easy, and that is very clear, right? They're calling them illegal aliens. There's no great mystery here, right? Like, what are they using? When the Latinx community got bigger in the late 1990s, early aughts, that's when the story, the reports were like, Mrs. I used to remember her name like for a decade, but I've forgotten. Like, Mrs. Holmes thinks that, you know, Prairie Creek isn't what it used to be. And she has this quote, right? If people are just inside, out, you know, I wouldn't mind it, but they're out there, you know, playing soccer. And so I started seeing this pattern. So it was a pattern, right? I was like, oh, here's this woman who is just objecting to the use of space. It's not even about a misuse. And then here's this other person that's also complaining, and this other person, this other person, this other person, right? So it's not like, I'm not a quantitative, like, I'm not a social scientist. So I'm not going to tell you there were like 3,000, you know, instances of complaints about the use of space. But I thought there was enough there that I just kind of not flippantly, but just as I was writing, you know, in a rush, a chapter, I think, for my advisor, I said something like, oh, it's like acts of spatial illegality. And I was in a writing group, which you should all be when you're writing. And I shared the draft with my friend, and she was like, oh, what is this? What is acts of spatial illegality? I was like, I don't know. That's just what I came up to describe what I thought was happening, because the larger argument to that is that because Mexicans or Latinx people are constructed as illegal in Arkansas that all of their behaviors are constructed as illegal, even as they're not breaking social norms or mores. And so, excuse me, I said that to my friend and she was like, is this your idea or is this like, who said this? I was like, I did. And she was like, you should develop this. Like, you just throw it out. Like, we all know and we don't. And it seems like you really kind of found something. And so it just kind of grew from there, right? So I gave you that long story because it's not something that I ever thought, oh, I'm going to understand the way that they use. I mean, I wasn't even looking. My question was not, how do they use space? My question was, how are Vietnamese and Cubans and Mexicans racialized, right? That was a kind of broad question. And then the more I did my research, the more I understood space was really central to that. In lots of ways, the construction of Northwest Arkansas and racial cleansing, the use of Fort Chaffee and its relationship to the larger state, then the use of public parks. So everything kind of started shifting a little bit and coming into sharper focus. And that's really important to know because you all see the finished product and maybe you think, oh, she was looking for acts of spatial illegality. No, that was just something I kind of like tripped on. And then a lot of people are like, oh, this seems to make a lot of sense. You need to define this. You know, this seems like a useful way of thinking about this stuff.
Thank you, Dr. Cerdo.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions to ask? Maybe one last question, if there is a question. Maybe not. I feel like I have a lot of questions too, but I don't know how to formulate them because I am trying to think about space in regards to gentrification for my own research, but I'm trying to approach it in a transnational approach. I guess, do you have any like advice on how to do that, or like thinking
Tell
about
me a little bit more. So what about transnationalism, or what groups or what areas?
So I'm thinking about Langley Park for my dissertation research, and I am claiming that it's a transnational space. Mm-hmm. So what would gentrification or commercial gentrification specifically look like in a transnational space? So even Wanda and I were just talking about what it actually means to be Latinx, and because it's not just a predominantly Latinx community, you have, you know, Guatemalan Mayans in that space as well. So there's different types of hierarchies. There's already racialization that exists there. So what would the impacts be within that space?
Yeah.
Maybe we're going over, I don't know, but if you wanted to.
No, I mean, I think like the advice I could give you is to think a little bit more, one, about what makes, and again, Wanda can regale you with stories about how one of the things I ask graduate students to do is to define their terms, right? So what makes, like, what makes Langley Park transnational? B, why is that important? Like, why, if you take transnational out of it, does it change anything? If it doesn't change anything, then it might not be as useful a rubric as you think it is. But if you can identify why, okay. And then 3, how does gentrification alter the transnationalism or vice versa, right? And you can start with something very easy, like, for example, like in Langley, well, I think this is still Langley Park, right? What is that? I always forget that. New Hampshire and University?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
like I go sometimes to that. Well, I think of it as that Mexican grocery store, but it's not. It's an international grocery store, right? It's like Latinx and African and Caribbean. So let's say that you realize that owner, what is that store called?
Which one?
That grocery store?
New Grand?
No. Or New Grand?
New Grand?
No.
Megamart?
It's not Mega, it's the other one.
Red Apple.
No.
I'm just throwing them
Anyways,
out now.
let's go with Megamart. Let's go with Megamart, which also sells, right? Like, let's say you realize that the owners of Megamart are, I don't know, I'm going to say Guatemalan, right? Are Guatemalan owners that actually...
I think they are.
Oh, Very cool. See? That actually make and like donate to political campaigns back in Guatemala, right? Then you can think about the reason why that would be a good example of transnationalism is because you have money that they're making here from lots of different people that actually ends up back in Guatemala, where they are supporting either conservatives or progressives or liberals or whatever, right? And then you would have to, well, not have to, but you might trace the impacts of that, right? Do the policies they support then create displacement that ends up back pushing people out of Guatemala and maybe into Langley Park again, right? Then that's a really kind of interesting dynamic study of the way in which transnationalism acts as a circuit. But if they're just Guatemalan who own the mega marts, don't donate to Guatemalan politics, only send money back to their home families, and don't do anything else, and it doesn't seem like there's much there except that they are a transnational family economically, right? So that's where you kind of have to start thinking about like what is at stake, or the ever dreadful question of so what, right? Because if you were my student and you came and you told me they own Mega Mart and they send money back home to a family in Guatemala, I'd be like, okay, yeah, cool. And that alone doesn't matter for gentrification. But if somehow, you follow the money and you end up finding out whatever, let's say instead of sending family back to Guatemala, that they actually come from money in Guatemala, and that's why they can own the store here. And then here they're, aligned with policies that displace people from Langley Park. Then that's like another version of transnationalism with like much clearer kind of ties to gentrification, right? So you kind of have to do research first and kind of uncover different kind of areas to see what connections you see. And then you can kind of either say, okay, what I thought was there, transnationalism and gentrification, isn't there. It's really this other thing. And you switch your question because the evidence you're uncovering doesn't actually fit the question, right? You also have to be adaptable to like altering your question, maybe changing your methods based on the evidence that you're able to find or to gather, right? Because the only way you would find out if this family has ties to Guatemala and supports certain politicians is if papers on either the US or Guatemala publish them, or if you have like inside access to their finances, right? But you probably don't. So you're limited to what you're able to find in the public record.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. I like that feedback. Does anybody else have a question? Okay, so a lot of people left comments, just making sure that you read them. They really appreciate your talk, very informative. So thank you again for speaking to us today. I really appreciate it. I really liked listening into your research and what you've done, and really resonated with me, especially with my question, what I asked you right now. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for tuning in and joining in today. Thanks for the applause, Wanda.
Thank you so much for having me. And if any of you were a little shy, feel free to email me with any questions you might have.
Yeah, I'm interested to know, I would like to know more about the Latino studies program at school as well. But yeah, that's another conversation we can have.
Absolutely.
or I'll ask Wanda too.
She can give you the primer, and then we can get into the nitty gritty.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Of course.
Bye. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.